Rectors, Vice Rectors, Eminences, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's in Central Europe we tend to use all sorts of titles, especially in Vienna. So everybody, if you go to Vienna Coffee House, is at least the president. So welcome from my side also to all of you. Thank you for this invitation. And thank you for giving me the chance to open this discussion as a central ambassador for the University of Vienna. And it's true what the Vice Rector said. I feel very close to the University of Vienna. And actually, after my dissertation here, the first book that I presented was a book about Central Europe. It was called Projekt Mitteleuropa, Project Central Europe. In '86, nobody knew, we didn't know what would happen in this region. And that's why we tried to make it a political book, to see how changes are possible in this time. And the reason why me being here is not by chance, is that I decided with my co-author, the late Erhard Busek, to write, now it's two and a half years ago, a book called Central Europe Revisited. What happened in between? And is there something like a new life to the idea of Central Europe? And is it necessary? And the interesting thing is, we didn't know what would happen when we wrote the book 2.5 years ago, that the subtitle of our book was Why the Future of Europe Will Be Decided in Central Europe. And I think this has become very clear in the last more than 100 days of warfare what it means. It means that thinking about Europe as a concept and thinking about the relationship and the borders in Europe, it will be decided in the central part of Europe. It will not be decided in Portugal. It will not be decided, not even in Paris, I'm allowed to say, or in Berlin. Although I hope that in Berlin some decisions will be taken. I'm not criticizing the German foreign policy of the late Merkel era, but in the European field, there was not much of acceptance of new ideas. I think we can agree on this. We ambassadors here at least can agree on this. I'm not a politician. And the idea is really, what does this mean? If we accept that the major decisions of how Europe can go forward will be decided in this part of Europe, what is our influence on this? Are we again in this part, the periphery, where the decisions are taken somewhere else, or is this a chance that this string of countries, and I'm saying now between Germany and Russia, can have an influence on what's happening? And I gave my keynote the title, Is Russia the Tragedy of Central Europe Again? And let me be very clear, my answer is yes. Russia is at the moment the tragedy of Central Europe again, because what's happening? What are the consequences for our region? The major consequences are humanitarian ones, which mainly the Central European countries have to take care of, including Germany and Austria in this field. And secondly, it demands, which is maybe even more important, it demands political decisions that the Central Europeans do not want to take normally in normal times. It demands to say, we are West, and have nothing to do with the East, or even not with Russia. And this is something, when you look into the history of the Central European region, has always been the case that the Central Europeans tried to avoid, to make these sorts of decisions. It was always imposed on them, actually, and just talking about the decades of the Iron Curtain, it was very clear that for the Central European region, this was an unacceptable position because there was no more any possibility to be a Central European. You could either belong to the West, or you could belong to the Warsaw Pact or to the Soviet Empire and its outlet. And this sort of situation has come back with the 24th of February. That's why for the Central European region, we have to be very careful that we do not fall into the trap that we again see a dividing line in Europe which allows only a Western part and the East. And that's very difficult to explain to people who come from somewhere else, but it's very easy. Whenever I am asked about this, how my reaction to this totally unjustifiable war of aggression of Russia is, I'm always saying, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise. Just read the articles in the late Soviet period of the Central European intellectuals. Read articles by, I don't know, all of them actually, Michnik or Kiš in Serbia, or certainly Milan Kundera in Czechoslovakia. You find it there. And what I say is, read especially the famous article by Kundera from 1984, New York Review of Books, The Tragedy of Central Europe. The Tragedy of Central Europe. And in this article, for preparation for this keynote, I reread it and I was surprised that everything that he speaks about is still a topic now in the given situation. Because, and I'm not referring to all parts of it, you should read it yourself, because he starts with one idea. He tells the story of Hungary 1956, and then he tells the story of the director of the Hungarian news agency, whose last words before he was killed by the Red Army were, "We are going to die for Hungary and for Europe." That's what the Ukrainians are saying now after 24 February. We are going to fight for Ukraine and for Europe. It is all there. Then he continues saying the Russians are trying to make sure that Central Europe does not exist. They want to have either East or West. And that's, again, that's the same. What Russia is intentionally and unintentionally doing is trying to create new division lines, which are hard division lines. So where you have to decide. In the Russian mind, at least in the Kremlin mind, it is very clear that Belarus and the Ukraine should be part of the Ruski Mir, of the Russian world. And with Belarus, they found a way which avoided that they have to interfere militarily, but for instance, together with Mr. Lukashenko, they decided that Russian troops can be stationed. And Russian troops actually from the Belarusian side also attacked the Ukraine, trying to have a successful attack on Kiev after the 24th of February. But with the Ukraine, Mr. Putin, in various articles, and also when he declared the war, more or less the war, but he called it differently, as we all know, he said the Ukraine actually should not exist. The Ukraine actually should be part of the Russian world, and it was only an invention. The Russians are listening in. It was only an invention of the Soviets, of the Bolsheviks. A fantastic story for him. So he can say, you see, this was the communists. I'm not a communist. I'm different, but I'm a Russian nationalist working for the Orthodox Church. But the Ukrainians are simply Nazis, militarized by the West. The CIA is behind everything that happened on Maidan and so on. This narrative, which he used to declare the war, is the narrative of creating a new, if even ideological border in Europe. An ideological border because in everything he says, and this is followed by the former Prime Minister Medvedev and others, he says it's a fight against he says it even, against a decadent West. It's a fight for our civilization. He calls it Russia has a different civilization. And you can read all this in the article that in New York Review of Books, Mr. Kundera wrote in 1984 from the other side, as a Czechoslovak intellectual dissident writing already from Paris when he wrote this. He couldn't have written that from Prague, where he said actually the Russians are a totally different creed of people. They have nothing to do with us. They have decided that they would go the other way, and you find all sorts of literary examples. I'm not going to read them out here, but the main point is he tried to show that actually Russia is an absolutely different civilization. I'm not saying that he's right. I'm just saying what the Russians are doing now in the given situation. They are creating a situation where we in Central Europe have to make decisions again. That either we accept this idea that there are two civilizations in Europe and we have to decide militarily and politically and mentally where we want to go, and not to have the possibility of Central European decision-making. And this, we as Central Europeans have to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm not going to stress too much what Milan Kundera was also afraid of, basically. He was afraid of the very old tradition of that everything that is between Germany and Russia is always in danger. Always in danger, because these are mites which have nothing positive about small nations. They don't understand small nations in between, and they want to destroy them. Well, actually, in the 20th century, it almost became true. Second World War, but also certainly in the Soviet period. So there is always this feeling that in this region, it is decisions which are coming from outside. And this is just a zone in between. And I have to admit what the European Union did with this part of Europe, the Central European region, was not very unequivocal, because to some of these small countries, we promised membership of the European Union. And we gave membership to the Baltics and to Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. But we left out important parts of the Central European culture, I would even say. Kundera is very strong about calling it a separate culture from the West and the East. But it's not our topic. It's just to let you know how many intellectuals are still confident that it makes sense to discuss what's happening in this region in the context of European peace and security. And he said, actually, this is what makes it so difficult, because we have the experience, we in this region, that we are always either in the trap of the West, whatever the integration project is called, or in the trap of Russia, whatever Russia is called at that time. And this feeling of create something, as Kundera says, in the 80s, and I say now, is the feeling that we have to invest more in identity and culture than is good for our political system. We simply have to talk more about identity issues than about the economy partly. And this is a real danger that the war in the Ukraine is bringing to the front line, actually, now. It's different now in the Ukraine. There's a different problem, which is much more urgent. But if you look about the possible consequences, the main consequence, as I see it, is that it demands, again, from our part of the world, decisions whether we are on the one side or on the other side, and we are not allowed to create any sort of trust-building institutions. All those people, speaking as an Austrian now, all those people who for years were called Putin-Versteher or Russland-Versteher, they closed their mouth on the 24th of February. And I'm saying that's understandable, and I'm saying that's right. But still, you have, not only in Austria, but also in other parts of Central Europe, people who have an experience of how to work with Russia, what the experience is. We have intellectuals in our universities which understand maybe what's going on in this part of the world better than our Western Europeans. So we should, at least on this level, we should allow to create something that a common understanding that there will be a day after the war. There will be a day after the war. As a historian, if there is one certainty, then this is something that I can say actually all the time. So let's be aware that we are forced to be identity builders all the time, and that shouldn't be all that we do, I have to say. And finally, his point in this article is not about Russia, although he said Russia is a tragedy of Europe. You know what his point is? And this, again, is the same point that we have today. He said the real tragedy of Central Europe is that Europe has forgot about its own value. Europe has forgot that we have to defend our values. We have to really try to understand what liberal democracy means, how we can formulate all this. And he said that's a tragedy for all the dissidents at his time in the Soviet Eastern Bloc that nobody in Europe, he says, Western Europe, thought about Europe again. And so you have much more talking about Europe in Central and Eastern Europe than you have in Western Europe. And we see this again in the war in Ukraine. It's certainly the case that Mr. Zelensky is using the word Europe also for public diplomacy to get support. He's quite good at that. But there is truth in it as well, that they are also fighting for the values of Europe. And I hope that it's not true. I hope that it's not true what Kundera said about in 84, that the West has forgot about what Europe means as a value, and is just talking about the practicalities of working together. So my major input into this is that there are real consequences for the Central European region where we should be aware that we are not driven into a situation where we are again between big power decisions only. And these big power decisions now are European Union and Russia. In spite of all the differences of the two sides, it's the fact, that's where we live actually. And it is, even includes the member countries like Austria and the other Central European member countries. So let's not allow people to abuse the war in the Ukraine to create a sort of periphery thinking in our region again, but let's use it as something where we can create more than being just a sphere of influence space between Russia and the West, and let's learn a little bit that Europe in between can be a value. I'm not a monarchist, but the Habsburg monarchy was certainly one of those attempts to give a chance to the region between Germany and Russia to develop its own small Europe. It did not work, as we know. But go to Brussels. Hundreds of think tankers, politicians, mainly former politicians, are saying, well, actually, there are lessons from the Habsburg monarchy regarding administration, regarding the law system, and so on. We shouldn't overestimate the truth in these sort of lessons from the Habsburg monarchy, but what is sure that the idea that one forms its own power here, be it the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, be it the Habsburg monarchy, is something which is worth considering now, being a regional power also in the European Union. When we work together in the Central European region, we are a remarkable force, economically, politically, and I think also socially, if we can work together. The problem is that what the tragedy that Russia brought here is also that this decision-making in Central Europe has become divided again among the Central European countries. It had already been mentioned, some of the countries in Central Europe have been heavily criticized as far as rule of law is concerned. And for the Western European mind, this is now very difficult to understand why Poland, for instance, is such a role model as far as refugees is concerned. And I would say, fortunately, they understand now that maybe if you have a Central European background and tradition, your way of understanding how politics is running is a bit different than when you have formed your Western Union in the 1950s and 1960s. The same is partly true, at least, I think, for Hungary. Also in Hungary, I personally, and this is a keynote, so I should provoke you also a little bit, there is a little bit a bigger problem, I think, with Fidesz government. I'm sorry to say so, but if finally we've got the sixth sanction package together as far as oil embargo is concerned, and then your prime minister stands up and says, no, the Patriarch Kirill should not be on the sanction list because, I know why, because he also thinks that the church and religion is sacrosanct, and he doesn't want to have a religious leader on the list. But I tell you, I know the Patriarch from my time in Moscow, and he is that close politically with Kremlin. He is just following the orders of political leaders, and political leaders which are dictators at the moment. And he is promising the Russian soldiers that they go to heaven. And that's something in the European context we should not allow simply. And that's why I think this is a right symbol to put him on the list. I don't know what your prime minister will do finally, but I hope he will also understand why this is a necessary step. But you see, such a simple example already. of should the Patriarch Kirill be put on a sanction list or not, can divide us, even in the Central European context. So we should be very aware what's happening here. And my very last point is, I shouldn't be too long, is what we didn't understand, because when people ask me, did you expect that Mr. Putin will start the war? I always said, my last report as an ambassador from Moscow was, Russia is doing an aggressive foreign policy. They will only stop when they are stopped by strength and force. And the best thing that we can expect, I wrote, is peaceful coexistence. And you know what peaceful coexistence was the key word? It was the key word of the Cold War. And if that's the best, we are not in a good situation. And that's what's true also after the start of the war now. And if we would have listened to some of our Central and Eastern European friends, the warnings they had, we could have acted earlier and we should have acted earlier. I'm not telling you what I think, whether we should have allowed Ukraine to join NATO, but I'm telling you that I was always in favor of giving Ukraine a real chance to join the European Union. And I'm in public saying these days now that Austria and the European Union should grant the candidate status to Ukraine by the end of this month. I'm not sure whether this will happen. There is a possibility. But if we would have listened, even to Milan Kundera, the quote, this is the final word that I give you. He said, in 1984, in Central Europe, the eastern borders of the West, everyone has always been particularly sensitive to the dangers of the Russian might. We didn't listen to it in 1984. We don't listen to it, it seems to me, some of us, in 2022. But I'm a diplomat, so I'm an optimist because, as I said, diplomacy finally will have to prevail. But I have to say, knowing the situation in Russia a little bit, we will have to deal with the same people. We will have to deal with Mr. Putin, and we will have to work with him in spite of everything. But it will be certainly a weaker and more isolated Russia. I hope I could give you some ideas for your discussion this afternoon. Thank you.